I had never thought of my dog, Rusty, as a weapon. He was a golden retriever, 12 years old, with a limp in his back leg and a heart too big for his body. He had been with me through a divorce, a bankruptcy, and the endless humdrum of starting over in a new community. Rusty was family. So when the HOA president, Karen Whitmore, the queen of condescension and rigid rulebooks, stood at my doorstep wagging a folder of violations in my face, I wasn't prepared for the fire she lit inside me. Her voice carried that shrill tone people adopt when they're not just trying to enforce rules, but to remind you they have power. Your dog barks. He sheds on common grounds. He frightens the neighborhood children, she recited, as if Rusty was some rabid beast instead of the gentle lump of fur lying behind my legs, tail-thumping at the sound of her voice. He frightens children? I repeated, almost laughing. Rusty, who had been dressed in fairy wings last Halloween by the neighbor's daughter and paraded like royalty down the block, frighten children? The accusation was absurd. Karen smirked, eyes narrowing behind designer frames. We have had complaints, and the bylaws are clear. No nuisance animals. If the board votes to enforce this, you may face fines and eventual eviction. That word, eviction, stuck like glass in my throat. I had rebuilt my life here. My home was modest, my job stable, and Rusty was all I had left of the family I once dreamed of having. Losing him wasn't an option. Losing my home wasn't either. I watched her march down my driveway, clipboard swaying, heels clicking like gavel strikes. Something about her confidence, her absolute certainty that she could bulldoze me into submission, burned away my initial fear. For the first time in a long time, I felt that sharp, cold clarity that comes right before you decide you're not just going to fight back, you're going to win. That night, I sat with Rusty, running my hands over his fur as he dozed. His breathing was steady, his trust in me, absolute. They think you're a nuisance, I whispered. But what if you're the cure? It started as a flicker of an idea, something that seemed too outlandish to be real. But the more I thought about it, the more I saw a path not just to defend Rusty, but to turn the entire HOA against its own leader. Karen hated dogs. That much was obvious. But if Rusty wasn't just my dog, if he became the community's dog, if he became something bigger than her rules, then what would she have left? The next morning, I drafted a proposal. I didn't take it to the HOA board. I took it straight to the people. The first door I knocked on belonged to Mrs. Henderson, a widow in her late 70s, who rarely left her porch. Her husband had passed her 2 years earlier, and her children lived states away. Rusty adored her, often dragging me to her steps during our walks. When I explained my idea, therapy pets for the neighborhood, her eyes softened. "Oh, honey, that dog of yours is already therapy to me." Word spread faster than I expected. The Johnson twins begged for Rusty to visit after school to help them with their reading. Mr. Patel, who suffered from anxiety after a heart attack, asked if Rusty could sit with him during his daily exercises. Within 2 weeks, Rusty had a schedule fuller than mine, and with every smile he drew, with every hand that reached down to scratch behind his ears, the neighborhood began to shift. People stopped talking about fines and bylaws. They started talking about Rusty. I documented everything. Photos of Rusty comforting the Henderson widow, videos of him lying patiently as the Johnson twins stumbled through their storybooks, testimonies from neighbors about how his presence calmed their nerves, lifted their spirits, made them feel less alone. I didn't just build a defense, I built a movement. Karen, of course, noticed. She cornered me one evening by the community pool, lips pursed in a tight line. "What do you think you're doing?" she hissed, low enough so others wouldn't hear. "Your dog interferes with our bylaws. It's an insult." I smiled, the kind of smile that comes when you know the other person has already lost but hasn't realized it yet. Rusty isn't breaking the rules, Karen. He's healing people. You want to evict a therapy dog? Be my guest." Her nostrils flared, but she said no more. She stormed off, clutching her clipboard like it was the only weapon left in her arsenal. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. Normally, only a handful of residents attended, but that night, nearly the entire neighborhood showed up, and they weren't there to support Karen.
When she launched into her tirade about violations and nuisance pets, people interrupted her. Mrs. Henderson stood and spoke about how Rusty had given her a reason to smile again. The Johnsons presented drawings of Rusty as their superhero, complete with cape and mask. Mr. Patel, a normally quiet man, delivered a heartfelt plea about how Rusty's presence helped lower his blood pressure and gave him the courage to exercise. The board shifted uncomfortably. Karen's words landed like stones in water, sinking without ripples. And then it was my turn. I didn't argue or beg. I simply presented Rusty's new role, the Neighborhood Therapy Pet Program. I showed them the testimonies, the photos, the videos. I unveiled a plan to expand, inviting other neighbors with well-behaved pets to join. "This isn't about breaking rules," I said. "It's about building community. Isn't that what we all moved here for?" The applause that followed drowned out Karen's objections. For the first time, the board voted against her recommendation. Rusty wasn't just safe, he was celebrated. And Karen? She sat there red-faced, trying to keep her composure as her authority slipped through her fingers. But victory wasn't enough. Not yet. I knew Karen, and I knew she wouldn't let this go. Her pride was her engine. She'd claw, scratch, and scheme to get the upper hand again. What she didn't realize was that every step she took to undermine me would only bury her deeper. Because Rusty wasn't just mine anymore. He belonged to the community, and every time she tried to strike at him, she'd be striking at her own neighbors. I didn't just want to win. I wanted to make her the villain of her own story, and I wanted her downfall to be public, humiliating, and unforgettable. Rusty thumped his tail against the carpet that night as if he understood. Maybe he did. Maybe he knew that Karen had started a war. But what she didn't understand yet was that she hadn't picked a fight with a man and his dog. She'd picked a fight with an entire neighborhood, one that had already chosen its side. And I had only just begun. Karen was not the type to retreat quietly. That much was obvious. When the next week she began a crusade of whispered rumors and anonymous flyers tucked into mailboxes. Dogs carry disease, the flyers warned in bold, ominous letters. Protect your children. Stop the so-called therapy pet scam. I collected one from my own mailbox, laughing at the desperation that reeked off the cheap paper. The language was sensational, the fear-mongering transparent. But what amused me most was that she thought the neighborhood, which had already felt the warmth of Rusty's presence, could be swayed back into her corner by shadows and lies. Still, I knew I couldn't underestimate her. Pride makes people reckless, and reckless people can still cause damage. So I doubled down. I organized weekly therapy afternoons on the communal lawn. Rusty became the guest of honor, but I invited others to bring their pets too. Gentle labs, calm cats and carriers, even one neighbor's therapy rabbit that sat perfectly still while children stroked its fur. The events became the highlight of the week. Families who never spoke to one another now mingled over blankets and lemonade, swapping stories while their kids rolled in the grass with Rusty and his furry friends. Karen tried to shut it down, of course. She appeared one afternoon, clipboard in hand, shouting about unauthorized use of communal property. But by then, she was outnumbered. Mrs. Henderson stepped up, cane in hand, and told Karen she had no right to rob the community of something so good. Parents shook their heads at her, children ignored her, and the board members who attended simply shrugged. "It's a community gathering," one of them said flatly. "We're not stopping it." Karen's face twisted, her carefully curated composure cracking. For the first time, I saw something beneath her armor. Fear. Not fear of me, not fear of Rusty,
but fear of losing control. And that's when I realized what would truly undo her. She had built her throne on power, not respect. She had demanded obedience through rules, fines, and intimidation. But now the community was tasting something sweeter, unity without her oversight. If I could nurture that, she wouldn't just lose a battle, she would lose her crown. 2 months later, the program had grown beyond anything I imagined. We had volunteers from neighboring communities asking to join. Local therapists reached out, offering support and guidance on how to structure it formally. Even the town's small newspaper ran a feature titled, "From Nuisance to Neighborhood Healer: How One Dog Changed a Community." Rusty's picture, tongue lolling and eyes shining, sat at the top of the page. Karen must have choked on her morning coffee when she saw it.
She retaliated by calling an emergency board meeting. Her motion? Ban all pets from communal spaces. The room filled again, neighbors packed shoulder to shoulder, some holding their pets in quiet defiance. Karen ranted about liability, about insurance, about the sanctity of community order. Her words bounced off a wall of folded arms and frowning faces. When it came time to vote, the board didn't just reject her motion. They passed a new one, officially recognizing the Neighborhood Therapy Pet Program as an approved community initiative, with a small budget allocated to support it. I watched her sink into her chair, stunned into silence. For the first time, the board had stripped her of her authority in plain view. And it wasn't just a loss. It was a humiliation. But humiliation can drive people to desperate places. It was late on a Friday night when I heard the pounding on my door. Karen stood there with 2 animal control officers waving a complaint in the air. "This dog," she shouted, pointing at Rusty, who wagged his tail at the visitors, "is dangerous. He bit a child. I demand he be removed immediately." The accusation was so outrageous I almost laughed. But the officers weren't laughing. Procedure dictated they investigate, and suddenly Rusty was at risk again. Neighbors gathered as word spread. Mrs. Henderson, the Johnson twins, Mr. Patel, everyone who had stood with me before now crowded my lawn, protesting loudly. "Rusty has never bitten anyone," they insisted. Parents came forward, putting their children's hands on Rusty to show how gentle he was. The supposed victim? No one could name them. Karen muttered about anonymous reports and concerned parents, but no child came forward, no evidence appeared. The officers, embarrassed, eventually apologized and left without further action. Karen was left standing in the street, her face blotchy with rage, while Rusty licked the hands of a dozen children surrounding him. That was her final misstep. She had shown her hand too clearly. This wasn't about rules anymore. This was about her hatred for me, for dogs, for anything she couldn't control. And the community saw it for what it was. The HOA election came not long after. Normally, turnout was low. Not this year. Nearly every household showed up, many wearing T-shirts I hadn't even known were printed. Rusty's face in cartoon form, underlined with the words, "Our community's best friend." Karen campaigned desperately, knocking on doors, pleading that only she could restore order. But every whisper campaign, every attempt to twist reality, only reminded people of what she'd tried to take away. When the votes were tallied, she wasn't just unseated as president, she wasn't even re-elected to the board. Her power evaporated in a single night. But the story didn't end there. The new board, with fresh faces and energy, threw their support behind the therapy pet program in full. We hosted larger events, community fairs where Rusty and his fellow therapy pets were the stars, booths offering information about animal-assisted therapy, even partnerships with local hospitals and nursing homes. Rusty, once labeled a nuisance, became the symbol of our neighborhood's unity. And Karen? At first, she avoided everything. She sulked behind her curtains, watching the laughter from her window. But then came the day when her own mother, who had recently moved in with her after a stroke, was wheeled out by a caregiver to attend one of our therapy afternoons. I'll never forget the look on Karen's face as she arrived to fetch her mother and saw her, smiling, stroking Rusty's fur, laughing in a way that seemed to lift years off her frail body. The very dog Karen had tried to destroy was now bringing joy to the person she loved most. Karen stood frozen, torn between pride and undeniable truth. She didn't speak to me that day. She didn't have to. I saw it in her eyes. She knew she had lost, not just in the HOA, not just in reputation, but in her own heart. Rusty had won. Months passed. Rusty slowed down, his limp more pronounced, his naps longer, but even in his twilight, he remained the beating heart of the program. At the annual community fair, the board unveiled a plaque on the lawn, in honor of Rusty, whose love healed us all. The crowd cheered. Rusty, too old to understand the words, but young enough in spirit to bask in the affection, thumped his tail against the grass. Karen stood at the edge, her mother in a wheelchair beside her, both smiling softly. For the first time, she wasn't clutching a clipboard, she wasn't barking orders, she wasn't fighting. She was just another neighbor, watching the dog she once despised become a legend. And as I looked around at the faces of the people, united not by fear, but by joy, I realized something. Revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is turning the thing your enemy hates most into the very thing they can't live without. Rusty was never a weapon. He was a healer. But through him, I had won a war Karen never even knew she'd started. And in the end, she wasn't just defeated. She was transformed. Rusty had done what no rule book ever could. He made us a community. And no one, not even Karen, could take that away.